The war had a way of revealing who could truly be counted on. Looking back, John Martin realized that some of the men who appeared the most ambitious and aggressive in training were not always the ones who proved most dependable in combat. There were soldiers who were intensely competitive, eager to earn more stripes or secure officers' bars. But when the fighting began, some of those same men found ways to avoid the front lines. By contrast, the men who consistently did the hardest jobs were often those who cared little for rank or recognition. Their only goal was to survive and help bring the war to an end. In John's mind, those were the soldiers who really got the job done. Combat had a way of separating the men who wanted to build military careers from those who were simply determined to endure. In peacetime, he reflected, everyone liked the appearance of a polished unit, with flags and ceremonies and all the outward signs of military pride. But combat was something entirely different. It stripped away appearances and exposed each man's true character. John remembered hearing many soldiers complain about a promise attributed to General Maxwell Taylor, that all he wanted from them was 2 days and 2 nights in combat, after which they could return to England. In reality, his company remained in Normandy for nearly 30 days. During that entire time, he somehow escaped without being wounded, despite the fact that many of the original members of Easy Company did not. When they finally returned to England, the loss was impossible to ignore. The sergeants shared one hut, while the men of 1st Platoon were housed in a large barracks that normally held about 30 soldiers. When they came back from Normandy, only about half of those men returned. He and Bill Garnier spent many hours thinking about what that meant. If they had lost half the barracks in one operation, and the war had only just begun, neither believed they had much chance of ever getting home. The realization weighed heavily on them. During a trip to Scotland, where they got tattoos and tried to enjoy themselves, they openly admitted what they both felt: they were unlikely to survive. If one little maneuver in France had cost so many men, how could they possibly make it through the remainder of the war? As time went on, however, his thinking changed. While he initially assumed he would never return home, surviving each operation gradually gave him a small measure of hope. By the time they prepared for Holland in September, he began to think that perhaps he might survive after all. That hope did not make him reckless. If anything, it made him more cautious. The operation in Holland felt different from Normandy. John believed it was better organized from Easy Company's perspective, even though the larger campaign was badly mishandled in some sectors, particularly among the British and Polish forces, where the fighting around the river crossings became a slaughter. One night along the Rhine, his platoon, reduced to roughly 15 or 18 men, occupied defensive positions on low ground near the river. They established small outposts, each manned by 2 soldiers. During the night, he made it a habit to rotate among these positions, often choosing to spend time with the men he considered less dependable, the ones most likely to fall asleep on guard duty. Earlier that evening, regimental headquarters had arranged for loudspeakers to be brought to the riverbank. Messages were broadcast in German, informing enemy soldiers that at midnight a smoke barrage would be laid down. During the smoke, American troops were ordered not to fire, and any Germans who wished to surrender could cross the river safely. The offer remained open until around 1 a.m., and several German soldiers did, in fact, come across through his sector. Once the smoke cleared, the front returned to normal. Later that night, around 2 or 3 in the morning, he joined one of the outposts, where he was paired with a soldier named Webb, a man who had fallen asleep on duty before. After making sure Webb was awake and standing watch, he crawled into the foxhole, covered himself with a shelter half, and went to sleep. He awoke suddenly to the sensation of someone stepping on his face. For a few disoriented seconds, he struggled to understand what was happening. The foxhole was cramped, and there were now 3 men in it instead of 2. Webb had fallen asleep, and a German soldier attempting to surrender had literally stumbled into their position. The German repeatedly said, "Comrade, comrade," trying to reassure them that he meant no harm. John searched the prisoner, finding only a razor on his person. He later learned that many of the German soldiers trying to surrender were ordinary conscripts who wanted no part of the fighting. Throughout the night, the sharp bursts of Schmeisser machine pistols could be heard across the river. They were not directed at the Americans, but at German soldiers, fired by SS non-commissioned officers trying to prevent their own men from surrendering. The whole situation was frightening at first, but in retrospect, he found it memorable and even somewhat ironic. When asked about the treatment of prisoners, John stated plainly that he had never killed a POW. Still, He acknowledged that such incidents did occur within the company and throughout the war. One Jewish soldier in the unit, he noted, was never trusted to escort German prisoners out of sight because his hatred of the enemy ran too deep. John was also asked about the many stories surrounding Ronald Spears. He smiled but declined to repeat rumors. Enlisted men and officers, he explained, lived in almost separate worlds. Most of what he had heard was gossip, though he admitted that Spears had a reputation for being wild and fearless. One of the most famous actions in Holland was what some later called the 1,000-yard charge, though John believed the story had grown in the retelling. The Germans had crossed the Rhine during the night in rubber boats, bringing a substantial force into the flooded fields and hedgerows near the American positions. By morning, it became clear that a significant number of enemy troops had established themselves across the river. Easy Company was ordered to drive them back. John took part in the attack. During the advance, he was accompanied by a machine gunner named Roy Cobb. As they moved through the hedges, they peered over one embankment and discovered 60 or 70 German soldiers lying shoulder to shoulder with their heads near the hedge, facing away from them. John immediately directed Cobb to set up his machine gun and fire straight down the line. Though later accounts emphasized fixed bayonets and dramatic charges, John viewed it as another combat maneuver, dangerous and effective, but not quite as romantic as history sometimes portrayed it. Among the men he remembered from the campaign was Punchy Deal, a sergeant from the original Tokoa group. Deal was highly respected and eventually earned a battlefield commission after Normandy. He was assigned to another battalion and later killed in Holland when an 88mm shell scored a direct hit on his position. Another vivid memory came during the advance near Nieuwenan, where Easy Company's mission was to protect the flanks of the British Second Army as it pushed north along a narrow highway toward the bridges deeper in Holland. John and Bob Rader were riding on a British tank when they halted near a wooded area just outside town. In the distance, about a quarter-mile away, they spotted a German panzer tank peeking around the corner of a building. They warned the British tank commander that the enemy was trying to lure them into the open. The British commander replied calmly, "Well, son, I can't shoot at him if I can't see him." Despite the warning, 3 British tanks rolled out of the woods and onto the road. Suddenly, a haystack in a nearby field split open, and a concealed German gun fired. The tank nearest the woods was hit immediately, and the others were trapped and destroyed in quick succession. John and Rader spent the night lying in a ditch, watching the burning tanks and realizing how expertly they had been ambushed. Not all of his memories from Holland were tragic. Cobb, the machine gunner from Harlan County, Kentucky, was one of the platoon's most colorful characters. Though he often caused trouble, he was also the company's best scrounger, always finding food and supplies when they were needed most. When the platoon moved up to relieve British troops on the Rhine, they occupied a farmhouse that had been heavily shelled. One room in the shattered building served as a makeshift command post, with blankets hung up to conceal a light. The men were told they could spread out into adjoining rooms. Cobb grumbled as usual, asking where to put his gear. He was told to throw his bedroll into the next room and settle in. A few moments later, Cobb burst back through the blankets, furiously wiping filth from his eyes and face. Hidden in the room was a shell-shocked calf, and when Cobb tossed down his bedroll, the startled animal had defecated directly onto him. The sight was so absurd that it became one of the funniest moments he could recall from the entire war. For all the humor and strange incidents, Holland remained a costly campaign. Easy Company suffered numerous casualties, and each battle reinforced the lesson he had learned since Normandy. In war, courage mattered, but reliability, caution, and sheer luck mattered just as much.